Hello and welcome. This is one of the most dangerous prisons in the world. They call it the mega prison. It's located in El Salvador. 40,000 people are held there under insanely strict conditions. And now even the US is sending migrants there. But guess what? This prison was actually built for a completely different reason. Not so long ago, El Salvador was the most dangerous country in the world. It had the highest murder rate. But today, it's the modern nation and a pretty popular tourist spot. People pay with Bitcoin there, they host the Miss Universe show. And believe it or not, El Salvador is now the safest country in the western part of the world. There are fewer murders than in Canada. And the reason behind this massive change? This guy, Nayib Bukele, the youngest and most popular president in all of Latin America. Total social media star. He proudly calls himself the coolest dictator in the world. His approval rating is higher than the Pope's and his friends Elon Musk and Donald Trump. These days, politicians from neighboring countries travel to learn from him. People are calling Bukele the model for future presidents and El Salvador a blueprint for other nations. But here's the thing, most stories leave out the second half. What did all these changes really cost? What is the coolest dictator in the world hiding? How exactly did El Salvador go from the most dangerous to the safest country? And maybe the bigger question, what can the world learn from it? Nayib Bukele. 2012. In the small town of Nuevo Cuscatlan in El Salvador, they were holding a mayoral election. Honestly, it wasn't even much of a town, more like a suburb of the capital. But this little place is exactly where big changes for the whole country would start. Running for mayor was a young businessman. He was 31 and he didn't look like any politician people were used to. His name was Nayib, an offspring of Palestinian immigrants and the son of a religious Muslim. His father had built several mosques around the country. So yeah, definitely not your typical Salvadorian backstory. And Nayib was always a little different. There's even a photo from his 1999 high school yearbook where he signed under his picture "School Terrorist." Even though, truth be told, Bukele came from a very wealthy family. His father was a businessman, the guy who opened the first McDonald's in El Salvador. Nayib went to a private school, dropped out of college, worked at a nightclub, did a term at a Yamaha store, and later jumped into political PR. And he finally decided to run for office himself. And on his very first election, he beat his opponent by just 200 votes, becoming the youngest mayor in the country's history. Trust me, there would be plenty more records after that. At first, his reforms hit that tiny town in Nuevo Cuscatlan like a hurricane. The new mayor opened a 24-hour hospital, built a library, handed out free food for elders. He even donated his own salary to find scholarships for school kids to study English and programming. And he ran his own social media accounts where he constantly posted about his work. The young politician grabbed attention fast, and after just one term, he got promoted. His party nominated Bukele to run for mayor of the capital, San Salvador. In Latin America, the mayor of the capital is usually the second most powerful person in the country. That's how much hope people were placing on Bukele. And remember, he had only entered politics 3 years earlier. And guess what? He won again. And once more, he went full speed ahead with huge projects, but now on a capital city scale. Renovations, new construction, shopping malls, restaurants, and even his first mega project, putting lights on at every major crossroads. And of course, he kept up his crazy active social media presence. Twitter, Facebook, live streams. Bukele didn't even bother with traditional press conferences. He would just answer questions directly online. All of it was part of his new personal brand. Sunglasses, baseball cap, leather jacket, photos of him with his feet up on the desk, rallies that looked more like concerts, board games, memes, Fortnite references. Instead of using his party symbol, he started pushing his own logo, a blue letter N. It stood for Nuevas Ideas, new ideas. And just a coincidence, his name also starts with this letter. Basically, Bukele became a full-on rock star. About 20% of the whole country followed him on social media, more than the sitting president. Oh, yeah, it was pretty obvious where he was aiming next. Pretty soon, during another one of his live streams, Bukele announced that he was running for president. It would be the third election of his life. His promise? To fight corruption. His campaign slogan was, "There's enough money if no one steals it." Of course, he ran the whole campaign almost entirely through social media. He didn't even bother traveling around the country, but honestly, that was enough. He won again for the third time. Not long after, President Bukele was taking selfies from the podium at the United Nations General Assembly, joking that more people would see the photo on Instagram than would ever watch the actual assembly. He looked like a president from the future. Times had changed, and this is how politicians act now. No wonder everyone in El Salvador was hyped for change. New president promised to build a modern country, one that would finally leave its past behind. And El Salvador's past, well, it wasn't pretty. It's important to understand that part to really get what happens next. For half of the 20th century, El Salvador was ruled by a military regime. It was a pretty brutal leadership, but by the 1980s, people were tired of it. So socialist ideas started getting really popular across the whole country. Honestly, it was a pretty typical story for Latin America at the time. You've probably heard about Cuba, but even nearby Nicaragua had seen socialists come to power. In El Salvador, left-wing fighters decided it was time to overthrow the government. A civil war broke out. The fighters got some support from other socialist countries, while the United States backed the regime. Because Ronald Reagan was a hardcore anti-communist, there was no way he was going to let another Cuba pop up right next door. Kind of reminds you what happened in Argentina, right? The civil war in El Salvador dragged on 12 weeks. 75,000 people were killed. Even more just disappeared. A quarter of the country's population fled abroad. It's honestly one of the darkest chapters in Salvadorian history. Eventually, though, the war ended along with the Cold War. The fighters and the military signed a peace agreement. Each side formed its own political party, and they just kept fighting for power in a different way. Meanwhile, the country stayed poor and broken. Corruption was everywhere. So was crime. El Salvador was so poor that 16% of its GDP came from money that people working abroad sent back home to their families. This was the kind of country Nayib Bukele was now running. He promised to fix all of it, but his plans didn't exactly sit well with two old political parties, because he had basically taken their power away. The only thing they still controlled was the parliament. They used it to block funding for his reforms at every turn. The fairy tale of the millennial president slammed straight into the harsh reality of Central American politics. But that's when Bukele showed he wasn't just good at tweeting. If needed, he could take what he wanted by force. One day, the president literally showed up at the parliamentary session with soldiers. Then he pushed through a reform that gave his supporters a majority in parliament. Yeah, it was a bold move, no doubt about that. But to a lot of people, it looked an awful lot like a power grab. Many criticized him for it. Did Bukele care? Not at all. He didn't mind bad publicity. As long as people were talking about him, he was winning. So he leaned into it. He started running his social media accounts in English and even updated his bio to say, "the coolest dictator in the world." 20 years ago, he was trolling his classmates. Now he was trolling the entire world. For most politicians, that would have been career suicide. But Bukele, he turned it into a marketing win, because he already had his next big project in mind. And it was going to be loud. The president started building a crypto state in El Salvador. They set up ATMs where you could buy Bitcoin. A part of the national reserves was converted into cryptocurrency. There were even plans for a Bitcoin beach resort and a full-on Bitcoin city. The El Salvador even started mining crypto using volcanic energy. On the other hand, it was about economies. El Salvador is a really poor country. It doesn't even have its own currency. They used the United States dollar. But honestly, it wasn't just about money. At the time, Bitcoin was making headlines all over the world. Naturally, everyone started talking about El Salvador too. Crypto companies rushed into open offices. If you invested in Bitcoin there, you could even get residency. And front and center of all this hype, Nayib Bukele himself. In just a few years, he had gone from a small town nobody to a global news sensation. But surprise, surprise, not everyone was thrilled about these plans. In March 2022, the whole image of El Salvador as a Bitcoin paradise came crashing down. Over just one weekend, 87 people were killed. All of them were victims of local gangs. And that was the message. Gangs were always been El Salvador's biggest problem. Remember that earlier when I've mentioned that a quarter of the population fled during the Civil War? Well, a lot of those refugees ended up in California, in the poor neighborhoods of Los Angeles. Back in the 80s, those areas were already home to infamous street gangs like the Crips and Bloods. For poor migrants, that whole lifestyle was often the only way to survive and make some money. So Salvadorian refugees started forming their own gangs too. Then in the 90s, the US cracked down on crime and deported thousands of those migrants back to El Salvador. They returned to a broken country, 6 million people, ex-soldiers without jobs, leftover weapons everywhere, and a whole generation that had grown up knowing nothing but war. Honestly, it was the perfect breeding ground for crime. Within just a few years, 2 major street gangs had basically taken over the entire country. They ran extortion rackets, kidnapped people for payoff, and recruited kids into their crews. You could literally be shot on the street just for looking the wrong way, and no one would ever bother to investigate. These gangs were perfectly fine with a poor, corrupt country where politicians spend more time fighting each other than fighting crime. But Nayib Bukele, he didn't fit into their plans. That weekend in March 2022, one of the victims was just a regular surf instructor. His body was left tied up on the road leading to Bitcoin Beach. This wasn't just a threat, it was a statement. Bukele's entire grand project was suddenly on the line. He was now facing the most dangerous enemy he could possibly imagine in El Salvador. Only, it seemed like the gangs had no idea who they had just picked the fight with. The president launched a plan in El Salvador called Mano Dura, a hard hand. So what it was all about? First, the country declared a state of emergency. People were banned from gathering in groups, and the police and military started massive raids. They stormed into homes and grabbed anyone who seemed suspicious, even kids, because yeah, kids could be gang members too. They were arresting people at home, in the streets, at work, about 1,000 arrests every single day. Anyone who even looked like they might be connected to a gang. In total, 80,000 people were locked up. That's 1% of El Salvador's entire population. You might do the math and calculate how many people in your country it would be. And of course, you couldn't just stuff that many people into regular prisons. So the next step, open a special mega prison, a detention center for terrorists, famous for its brutal conditions. Inside the prison, up to 100 people can be packed into a single cell. They sleep on metal beds and move around only in groups, crouched down and handcuffed. Break the rules, you get thrown into solitary, a completely dark room where you literally can't even see your own hands. In this prison, there are no letters, no packages, no visits. Escape? Completely impossible. And the worst part, none of the inmates there actually expect to ever get out. Oh, and don't forget the PR. This prison was promoted like a huge national achievement. A ton of people covered that story, and soon Nayib Bukele became the most popular world leader on TikTok. His approval ratings, they shot through the roof. At the next election, Bukele won 84% of the vote, and his party, which literally hadn't even existed a few years earlier, took almost every seat in parliament. It was a total blowout. Bukele became the most popular figure in all of Latin America. His approval rating higher than the Pope's. He turned his second inauguration into a full-blown global event. Dozens of famous politicians showed up, and it wasn't just a ceremony. It was a full-on show. Bukele designed brand new uniforms for himself and the soldiers. Guests were taken out to fancy restaurants, to the local Google office, and even led through the city at night, just to show off how safe everything had become. Now, Nayib Bukele has become the model for the whole region. Several countries are already saying they want to follow his lead. The president of Ecuador has declared his own war on gangs. Ministers from Argentina are traveling to El Salvador to learn from Bukele's team. Honduras has started building 2 mega prisons. Costa Rica, Guatemala, they're all looking at him. For all these nations, Bukele is living proof that you can crush your political enemies, attract foreign investment, and become a superstar, all at the same time. Bukele's got ties to Elon Musk, and Donald Trump recently struck a deal to start sending migrants, the ones US authorities label as criminals, straight to El Salvador. They're calling it outsourced prison. And honestly, a lot of people call Bukele a CEO president because he runs the country like it's a company. His goal? Maximum efficiency. But we'll talk about that kind of politics in a minute. The president of a poor country with just 6 million people has turned into a major player on the global stage, a key Trump ally in the region, and the poster child for other governments. And all of that thanks to the harshest crackdown on crime you can imagine. But there is this side to the story that usually doesn't get told, because every coin has 2 sides. Sure, you could say the approach worked. Murders dropped sharply and overall crime plummeted too. Today El Salvador is actually safer than Canada. Fewer people are leaving the country. Streets that were once deadly after dark are now lined with new businesses. Families are out enjoying the parks. Every year more and more tourists are visiting El Salvador. The country keeps popping up in lists of the best travel destinations. A nation once known only for war, corruption and gangs is now being called the capital of coffee, surfing and volcanoes. But there are a few important details people tend to forget. The state of emergency, which was originally meant to last just a month, has now been extended 28 times. It's still in effect today. Hundreds of people have died inside the mega prison due to brutal conditions. None of them ever had a real court case. And among the tens of thousands locked up, there are almost certainly innocent people too. Right now, El Salvador has the highest detention rate in the entire world. if you look at it by percentage of the population. And here's the thing, crime rates had already been dropping before Bukele even became president. On top of that, journalists discovered that some of these amazing numbers might be, well, a little suspicious. For example, the statistics on murders stopped counting cases where criminals buried the body. And surprise, surprise, those kinds of crimes suddenly started happening a lot more often. There are even rumors that early in his presidency, Bukele made secret deals with the gangs, maybe even granting them privileges, just to bring those murder stats down and get some good-looking numbers. Maybe that's why right now the Salvadoran president asking the United States to hand over gang leaders, the ones who might know a little too much about that chapter of his story. And the prosecutor who had been investigating it, yeah, he got fired. Also, it's worth nothing, the gangs in El Salvador aren't like the massive drug cartels in Mexico or Colombia. These were street criminals, mostly making money through shakedowns. It's a lot easier to crush them than it would be to dismantle a full-scale organized crime empire. But here's the kicker, a brutal war on crime doesn't automatically guarantee a happy future. El Salvador's economy hasn't exactly lived up to the hype. The dream of a Bitcoin nation, it flopped. Nobody really ended up using cryptocurrency. Investors pulled out. The money started drying up. El Salvador had to turn to the International Monetary Fund for help. But the fund set some tough conditions, and one of them was ditching Bitcoin. Honestly, Bukele's big headline projects often cause more problems than they solve. Even Nayib Bukele, the small town where his political career started, ended up being deep in debt after he left. And over just a few years, Bukele managed to concentrate almost all power in his hands. Parliament, courts, military, everything now works for him. Technically, the Salvadoran constitution says a president can only serve one term. But Bukele swapped out the judges just in time, and now he's serving a second term. And already thinking about a third. This whole story, it's not just about El Salvador. Nayib Bukele is a politician for the new era. His whole image, the social media, the cryptocurrency, the CEO-style leadership, it's all part of the package. He doesn't care about criticism, he answers it with bold action. And politicians like him are becoming more and more popular, especially in countries where traditional governments have failed to solve big problems. Chances are we're going to see a lot more leaders like him in the future. But here's the thing, if you don't like how a company is run, you can quit. How do you quit a country? So when people call him the coolest dictator, the real question is, are you more focused on the coolest or on the dictator? Thank you. Good night.